Well, hello everyone. This is Barry Jones with SP History, and we are beginning a series today. I think it'll be 5 or possibly 6 episodes that I have entitled All the President's Men. And I am specifically looking at E. Howard Hunt and his importance to both the Watergate scandal and the JFK assassination. And this is not in my words, these are not my views. This is President Nixon's view in his own words. So we're going to tie these two together. Obviously, JFK assassination happened in 63. Watergate scandal happened in 72 through 74. That was basically the American public's introduction to E. Howard Hunt. And but he had a long and storied career, which was mostly covert. And when within the CIA, and when Watergate happened, and his name was splashed across the headlines and his picture, he became a loose end, but a very important loose end, which is somebody and something that Richard Nixon was extremely concerned about, as indicated by his own words. All right, so E. Howard Hunt. Um, as I indicated, E. Howard Hunt had a long and storied career in the CIA, but we didn't know about it. We didn't know about it, and he had an alias or an alibi, or not an alibi, but an alias or a code name that he went by in a lot of these. And once the American people found out about this code name, the question had been to researchers such as JFK researchers for years, who was this Eduardo? And of course, until Watergate happened and that uh, knowledge became commonplace, it was hard to place who this Eduardo was within the CIA and his importance to all of these missions. Now, once Watergate happened and we found out who Eduardo was, you start going back and looking at documents and other places where Eduardo was involved. And it became pretty clear to JFK researchers that E. Howard Hunt was involved in the JFK assassination, even though he denied it and tried his best to cover it up. Uh, Late in life, right before he died, E. Howard Hunt had a sort of a come to Jesus moment. And after a lifetime of denying the obvious, after a lifetime of covert actions within the CIA's structure, and becoming one of the most trusted individuals in the covert activities realm, so much so that even the Nixon White House hired him as a $100 a day employee in the early 70s to help get Nixon reelected, to involve himself with the plumbers unit. So you're talking about a guy who had a decades long career of covert activities within the CIA, and as such was privy to some of the most controversial CIA actions of that period, stuff of which we found out during his church hearings in 75, which the American people considered to be criminal. He was neck deep in this stuff. And then he got hired by the Nixon White House. And then he was involved with the plumbers and the Watergate burglary. And during this time, his wife was a CIA operative as well. So this is the Hunt family is a very important puzzle piece. And if you can place this puzzle piece or several puzzle pieces, it helps complete the picture of a lot of things related to the JFK assassination, to Watergate. Anyway, as he was laying there dying, he finally, to his son and to another reporter, admitted his sins, so to speak. He unburdened himself and said, yes, I was actually in Dallas on the day JFK was assassinated. I was actually involved in the plot. Uh, I was a bench warmer. We'll go into all that, but he even listed the on a little 3x5 card, he wrote out the power structure and the flow chart, who called the shots, who was where, and who did what, and all those sorts of things. So we have that. And then he said, "May God have mercy on my soul for the deaths on my name and for the treachery I committed, betrayal of God and country. What a sad and horrible thing it is." So a life spent carrying out covert activities for the CIA did not necessarily lead to peace of mind for arguably America's number one spy for the CIA during this period of time. All right, so let's talk about how the American people found out about E. Howard Hunt. You got to assume that if there's one E. Howard Hunt working in the deep background for the CIA at any point in time, much less 60s and 70s, then there's probably many, many more that we don't know about. This is the one we do know about. On June 18th, 1972, there was an arraignment in Washington, D.C. for the 5 Watergate burglars and for 2 additionals that turned out to be lookouts across the street at the Howard Johnson Hotel. So 7 people total. Now, interestingly, the 5 burglars, as they were hauled away in the middle of the night, the next morning, this arraignment is taking place, and they have not yet had the benefit of a phone call. They've been held in this jail cell overnight for the purposes of this arraignment the next morning, but they have not yet had the opportunity to make their phone call. So the question was, when these prestigious lawyers show up to represent them the next morning, is how did they know? How did these lawyers know about these 5 arrests if no phone calls were made? Nothing had been reported yet. How did they know to show up and represent these clients if they'd never been asked or their presence hadn't been requested in the form of a phone call? Well, the answer to that question was when they found out that there were 2 lookouts across the street, Howard Johnson Hotel, watching those 5 burglars get hauled away. And these 2 lookouts, made all the contacts and arranged for these 5 burglars to have these prestigious lawyers show up. And almost immediately, these so-called freedom fighters, as they identified themselves, all 5 of these burglars, as they were standing before the judge, identified themselves as Cuban freedom fighters. And indeed, 4 of them were Cubans. And the judge kept pressing and pressing. And finally, he got them to admit who their bosses were, and one by one, they all acknowledged that they worked for the CIA. This is how we knew the day after the Watergate burglary that at the very least, this is a CIA operation because all 5 burglars worked for the CIA. None of the burglars would talk. And as investigators began looking into their personal bank accounts, they started noticing a pattern that each day that they didn't talk, new deposits were being made into their bank accounts. It looked a lot, very suspiciously, like hush money. One of these burglars had a White House connection. His name was James McCord. And James McCord was this salaried security coordinator for Nixon's committee to reelect the president. So here we have instantly a second very important connection, right? Just looking at the 5 burglars, I'm not even looking at the 2 lookouts yet. They get arrested subsequent. But James McCord was one of the 5 burglars. He was as we found out later, the wiretapping expert. He'd been brought along to fix the bugs, the malfunctioning bugs. And he was a salaried security coordinator for Nixon's committee to re-elect the president, which is run straight out of the White House. So instantly we have a connection to the CIA and to the Nixon White House. Then when the 2 lookouts were arrested, E. Howard Hunt being one, G. Gordon Liddy being the other, there's another connection to the White House because it was established at that point. Everybody knew E. Howard Hunt was CIA. They didn't know what he was in the CIA, but he was widely known as a CIA. He worked for the CIA. So there's another connection to the CIA, but he was also recently hired by the White House in 71 as a $100 a day consultant. Now, nobody knew what he was consulting. We found out later, but this is indeed another connection to the White House. And then you have G. Gordon Liddy pictured here on the far right. He was counsel to the Finance Committee of CREEP. Again, the committee to reelect the president. So you take all these 7 people total. 4 of them are Cubans. All 5 of the burglars claim to be Cuban freedom fighters. One of them, of the 5, is the security coordinator for Nixon's White House. And then the 2 lookouts both have connections to the Nixon White House, and one has another connection to the CIA. So it's clear that this is a CIA/White House operation, at the very least. And that's just after 24 hours. Through the course of the subsequent investigation, we began learning that, and this is a lot of this we owe because James McCord wrote a letter writing all this out, spelling it all out to the judge, Judge Sirica. And of course, James McCord is here pictured on the far right. That the White House was pulling the strings on this whole operation, and they had this special investigative unit called the Plumbers. And it was led by G. Gordon Liddy, who had recruited E. Howard Hunt into the operation. And Hunt, of course, was ex-CIA. And with the recruitment of Hunt, he knew he had this wide, long-reaching experience within the CIA and all these covert activities. He went and recruited some of his old pals who had been with him for years, carrying out covert activities for the CIA, reaching all the way back to the Bay of Pigs, which is, when they were planning all that, that was 59, 60, 61. So these guys, you're recruiting the people you know. So if you follow the flow chart, you understand it was Nixon's idea to create his own Einsatzgruppen within the White House. If you know anything about the Nixon entourage, all the powerful positions and people that were around him, they were mostly all German. It was a heavy German influence, the Nixon White House. And he was very much influenced by some of the things that had gone on in Germany prior to World War II, up to and including Hitler's use of an Einsatzgruppen as a special police force. When he couldn't count on the official police force to do his bidding, he hired his own people, and they became sort of the forerunners to the SS. Well, Nixon did the same thing. He hired his own Einsatzgruppen. He called them the Plumbers. The problem at the time was leaks coming out of the White House, leaks coming out of the federal government, which were embarrassing to the government, and the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover wouldn't do anything about it. So he put together his own special investigative unit, the Plumbers, to stop the leaks. And Gordon Liddy was put sort of in charge of this. And of course, one of your main jobs when you're in charge is to recruit people that you trust, that can recruit other people that can carry out these missions. So the recruitment of E. Howard Hunt was necessary because E. Howard Hunt had experience in covert activities, and he knew all the people that had experience in covert activities, and everything the Plumbers were going to be doing was going to be covert. Now, there's a more sinister purpose behind getting all these CIA people involved in the Plumbers unit, and it has to do with CIA malfeasance, whereby they wanted to infiltrate the Plumbers unit and know what Nixon was up to. So this is one of the favorite tricks of the CIA, is to infiltrate these groups with their people, who then just simply report back to them. And so they always know what's going on. At any time, they can turn it to their advantage. Anyway, most of his Bay of Pigs pals, or his prior CIA assets, were Cubans from Miami, because that's who had been involved in Operation 40 and Operation Mongoose and all these operations to rat fuck Cuba and get rid of Castro, the Bay of Pigs, and all of the Operation Mongoose activities. Obviously, they had a steady stream of these anti-Castro Cubans living down in Miami, and uh, they were sort of on loan from Santos Trafficante, the crime family boss down there, and they would be passed back and forth between the mob and the CIA. And these guys had been working for the CIA since late 50s, early 60s. And so he had some guys that he could go to. And that's why when you get to this Watergate burglary and you have the arraignment, four of them turn out to be Cubans because E. Howard Hunt recruited them. Now, I could go off in several directions here because some of the evidence that was discovered was so blatantly obvious. Uh, it, if you didn't know any better, you would think that this operation was a clusterfuck and that it was like a Keystone Cop operation. But if you know better, you realize that this was intentional because this was always intended to be discovered. They were supposed to get caught. And all of this evidence was going to hang certain people out to dry. So keep that in mind, the back of your mind as we go through this. Bernard Barker, one of the Cubans arrested, they found a little notebook, a little address book, as you see here pictured in his pocket. And as they were going through this address book, they found Hunt's White House phone number. It said HH at WH, and he gave a phone number. So even before the identity of James McCord, his role with Creep was known, they have a notebook or an address book from one of the burglars' pockets with a White House phone number and a White House contact, E. Howard Hunt. This is before they knew E. Howard Hunt was involved, that he was a lookout. This is partly how they found out that he had been across the street during the Watergate break-in, communicating with the burglars by walkie-talkie. Now, they found one walkie-talkie, so they knew somebody out there had the other one. And of course, when they found this address book and who was in it, the suspicion was that other person was E. Howard Hunt. Turns out that's exactly who it was. And of course, Hunt, as he watches the burglars get hauled away, immediately arranges for counsel for the burglars. And assuming that he's not going to be arrested, he's more worried about the five and how that could implicate him. But eventually, they find a room key also in poor Bernard Barker's pocket to that Howard Hunt, or to that Howard Johnson hotel across the street. And that's what led him to E. Howard Hunt, this command center where he and G. Gordon Liddy were shacked up. And that's how they found him. So Bernard Barker has this address book. He also has a room key. And so now all seven have been arrested. And it's on the front pages of the news. And American people are learning about this. They're not quite sure what to make of it. It is an election year. It's 72. But it appears that Nixon is sailing to a re-election victory, which of course he did. And so it's hard to believe that Nixon would be so reckless to order a burglary of the DNC headquarters with so much writing on it and so unnecessary. He doesn't need to spy on the Democrats. He's going to beat George McGovern handily. He doesn't need. There must be something more to it. But of course, these things take a long time to unwind. So a lot of what I'm sharing with you today is what we've learned subsequent. And then we're going back in time to put the pieces together to show you what's happening in real time. We just didn't know it was happening in real time. We didn't find out about it until later. So what happens with the Hunt family? I told you his wife was involved with the CIA as well. Well, Hunt plays his card. He's been arrested, and he has knowledge that the rest of us just don't have. He knows things that could really get Nixon in trouble. He knows things get a lot of people in trouble. And so he plays that card. And he, through his wife, began sending messages to the White House that if you don't pay us money, I'm going to tell everything I know. And this is why the White House immediately begins rounding up through campaign donations and other means, huge stacks of money to pay off these E. Howard Hunt, but also the five burglars. This is why their bank accounts start sprouting. This is in the old days when you can't make electronic transfers from your phone. You got to walk into a bank and you got to make a deposit. You got to write the slip, the account number, et cetera, et cetera. And you got to actually have the cash on hand or a check, whichever, and make a physical deposit. These guys are sitting in jail cells. E. Howard Hunt's sitting in a jail cell. Somebody on the outside is going to these banks and making these deposits on behalf of these burglars, on behalf of E. Howard Hunt, on behalf of G. Gordon Liddy. And it's all coming out of the White House. Of course, Hunt is leading this blackmail, this extortion effort through his wife. And his wife's the one communicating with the powers that be, White House, who are then forwarding messages up to Nixon, who we find out later on tapes is saying, yes, we can get that kind of money. And he understands real quick the importance of E. Howard Hunt. We'll get to that in a minute. But anyway, this extortion effort lasts for about 6 months. And Hunt, through his wife, just continued to ask for more and more money. And at some point, it gets out of hand. And the White House begins to drag their feet. At some point, they cut her off, which means they're cutting off E. Howard Hunt. And 6 months after the fact, E. Howard Hunt's wife is on his way to Chicago. She is riding with a CBS News reporter, Michelle Clark. And Michelle Clark the reason we know this is because Michelle Clark has telephoned or messaged her bosses in Chicago to arrange a press conference when they land. And at this press conference, she, along with E. Howard Hunt's wife, was going to expose Nixon's involvement in Watergate and the JFK assassination. They're going to blast everything wide open. And they're riding together on the plane to Chicago for the purposes of this press conference. They never arrive. Right before they get to the airport, this plane goes down in a neighborhood outside Chicago, kills everybody on board. And as the federal agents, which had already in advance surrounded the area where the plane went down and kept all the local authorities away until they had done their search, what they found in E. Howard Hunt's wife's belongings was $100,000 in cash in $100 bills. And she was allegedly bringing that money to pay to electronics specialist Michael Stevens in Chicago, who had provided a lot of the spying, bugging equipment that they'd been using in their plumber operations. It was his final payoff to keep him quiet. Anyway, by the way, something else I didn't mention, and I'm just skimming over this Watergate thing because you can go to my other episodes and I get into it pretty in depth. Those burglars also had big wads of cash on them when they were found, and they were in $100 bills, and they were fresh paper, and they were sequentially serial numbered, which is impossible unless you have access to the Treasury Department to get brand new bills in sequence. So you have pretty clear indication right off the bat through an address book, which has a White House phone number in it, a White House employee's name in it, E. Howard Hunt. You have CIA employees, you have creep employees. You have pretty strong indication that this is coming out of the White House, and obviously they're using the CIA to carry out this covert operation. And the fact that they have all this cash on hand is even further evidence of that. And it turns out not only they had this access to this cash, but E. Howard Hunt's wife, who was serving as the paymaster while E. Howard Hunt was languishing in jail, she was running around doing his bidding for him, blackmailing the White House, paying out all the cash. She was the one making these deposits, paying off these people. Well, now she's dead. And so is the news reporter who's going to engage in this press conference to reveal what the Nixon White House knew, not just about Watergate. Just think about that, what we would have found out in late 72, probably right before the election, that Nixon was involved in not just Watergate, but the JFK assassination 9 years prior. But we didn't learn about that because she died. Meanwhile, this is June 21st, 1972. So you figure the arraignment, I'm going back here just to show you the date, was on the 18th. So 3 days after the arraignment, we have the story of John Dean begins. And the reason we know about this is because we got to listen to the tapes. So we're going back in time, and they're all time stamped. So we know that on the 21st, this is 3 days after the arraignment, they are having a meeting in the Oval Office about this Watergate problem that they have. And of course, this is the famous tape that has the 18.5 minute gap in it, where they're talking and they're clearly talking about Watergate. And all of a sudden, the conversation turns to something really important. And there's this 18.5 minutes where it's just, they dubbed over it and there's no recording at all. And then it picks up again when they're talking about rather routine matters. And of course, everybody wants to know what was in that 18.5 minute gap. And Dean, he's the one that's involved in this conversation. And later, when he's asked about it, he says, "I don't remember what we were discussing." However, there is a record of what happened in there, and it comes straight from Dean himself. He just didn't know about it because the FBI had wiretapped his lawyer's offices. And when he was meeting with his lawyer, because clearly all of these White House people are going to be implicated in this, they're going to need to get representation. He's meeting with his lawyer. His lawyer asks him what was in that 18.5 minute gap. And Dean did not give his lawyer the same response that he gave the authorities or Congress. He told him the story. And the story is an unbelievable story. And that's what we're going to find out is what Nixon is so concerned about. And it's a story that Nixon is talking to Dean and others in this meeting, telling them why it is so important that all of this Watergate stuff go away, be covered up. And he gets specific, he gives details, he gives names. And this is the first indication to these folks in the room that Watergate has very long legs. And one of the things that Nixon said to Dean during this 18.5 minute gap that he said he didn't remember, but he clearly did because he told his lawyer, is he said that Nixon told him, quote, "You have to keep investigators away from this. We've got to get this completely shut off. We've got to shut the investigation down because this involves a covert operation that happened a long time ago. I was involved in it. And it involves these Bay of Pigs guys, these Cubans, and E. Howard Hunt, that were in the Watergate Hotel. It was an extremely sensitive operation, something different than the Bay of Pigs invasion itself. It's a deep and serious problem, and you have to do everything you can to keep this information from coming out." This quote by Nixon is extremely incriminating. It's loaded with information. He's talking about a covert operation that happened a long time ago. So he's clearly not worried about Watergate. He's worried about a covert operation that happened a long time ago that he was involved in. He says straight out, "I was involved in it." And it involves these people that were involved in Bay of Pigs, these Cubans. And he says it was not the Bay of Pigs. It was something different than the Bay of Pigs invasion, but involves these same people. So evidently there were a series of covert operations where these Cubans were involved in. He calls them the Bay of Pigs guys because they were involved in that as well. But there are other operations that he's more worried about. Bay of Pigs, everybody already knows about. These are other covert operations that he calls extremely sensitive. One in particular, it was an extremely sensitive operation, but it wasn't the Bay of Pigs operation. It was something different than that. It's a deep and serious problem. Anyway, the point is, it's clear. He's talking to his direct subordinates. He's saying, you have to do everything you can to tie this off because this reaches back to something way bigger than Watergate, way bigger. So one of the guys in the meeting was Bob Haldeman. And that's his chief of staff. So obviously he's going to be there. And during the course of this meeting, he informs Nixon, his boss, that John Dean had just been informed. This is on the 23rd, so this is 2 days later. So Bob Haldeman was in the know. John Dean was in the know because they were all in that meeting on the 21st. 2 days later, Haldeman comes back and he's talking to So you can imagine the scenario here. They got their marching orders on the 21st, cover up. So now guys like Haldeman are in full cover up mode. They're doing what their boss tells them to do. And he comes and he tells Nixon, he says, hey, I just wanted you to know John Dean has just been informed by Pat Gray, who's the acting FBI director. If you remember, this was right after J. Edgar Hoover dies. So there's a sort of a power vacuum at the FBI. Pat Gray is sort of the acting FBI director. No one intended for him to be permanent, but you got to have somebody in charge. So Pat Gray is informing John Dean that his deputy, Mark Felt, had told him the day before on June 22nd that he was going on the 24th to Mexico City because they also found in Bernard Barker's pocket, again, a check. So far, poor Bernard Barker, I say poor, this was all intentional. Bernard Barker carried an address book that linked the plumbers to the White House to E. Howard Hunt. He's got a room key that indicates there's lookouts across the street to Howard Johnson. That's how E. Howard Hunt, G. Gordon Liddy got caught. And he also has a check in his pocket to a bank in Mexico City called the Banco Internacional. And a quick search of that account, and who was listed as the sort of the manager of that account, or the owner of that account, was a Mexico City attorney named Manuel Aguirre. And Mark Felt, pictured here, right, felt like this check was important because obviously these Watergate burglars are getting paid out of this account. So they want to know everything they need to know about this account. Who's putting this money in this account? Who's depositing the money into this account that's later being paid out to these covert operators that are connected to the CIA and to the White House? So anyway, Pat Gray informs Dean. He says, hey, I just want to give you a heads up, let you know, Mark Felt's going down. And he's telling him this on the 22nd. The 23rd is when Haldeman tells Nixon, and the 24th is when Felt's supposed to go to Mexico City. So this is all happening like bam, bam, bam. And the question to Nixon was, is this going to be a problem? Incidentally, Mark Felt turns out to be one of I believe there were two deep throats, two inside sources that were feeding information to Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, the Washington Post. And this was all part of the setup to implicate Nixon. And it's one of the reasons why two reporters who have no experience on this level to be handling a story of this magnitude get chosen. One of them has ONI connections, Bob Woodward, and he's been placed at the Washington Post for this purpose, to break this story. And his inside source is the number 2 guy at the FBI and also the White House Nixon's later White House chief of staff, Alexander Haig, who was always climbing and stabbing people in the back and had inside information about things inside the White House. He was also feeding information to Bob Woodward at the same time. I believe he characterized his inside source as an individual, as one person. I think it was an amalgamation. I think he had 2 people, one inside the FBI and one inside the White House, feeding him info. Anyway, the information that these, especially Mark Felt, is feeding to Bob Woodward is that if you want to find out the truth about Watergate, you just follow the money. And so this is Mark Felt saying, I'm going to follow the money down to Mexico City. I'm going to find out who's paying for all this. So Bob Haldeman is reporting this to Nixon, and Nixon says, well, this is a problem. And you'll see why, because obviously he knows the roots or the history of that bank account, that bank. He knows what that bank account has been used for through the years, which is, of course, to pay all these covert operators for all these covert operations going all the way back to the time when Nixon was vice president in the 50s. And so if you allow this investigation to continue into this bank account, it's not just going to uncover So the bank account wasn't just created a year ago to pay these plumbers. It's been in existence for over a decade. It's been paying a lot of operators a long time, a lot of money for a lot of covert operations. And so he's concerned about, obviously, Mark Felt going down to Mexico City. So they're continuing this conversation, Nixon and Haldeman, and he's trying to figure out how do we get the FBI under control? This is right in the tapes. And of course, the White House can't order the FBI to back off. That's obstruction of justice. So they're trying to figure out how can we get around that obstruction of justice and order the FBI to back off. Well, there is an agreement. It's a long held agreement between the CIA and the FBI, in which if the FBI is involved in an active investigation into somebody involved with the CIA who has been acting domestically, illegally, because, the CIA is not supposed to act domestically. But the CIA can prove to the FBI that these CIA operators are involved in an active operation that if they are investigated, revealed to the public, would jeopardize that investigation. The FBI would drop it at the CIA's request. In other words, it's sort of a gentleman's agreement between the CIA and the FBI. We won't investigate your people, even though they're breaking the law and operating domestically. We won't investigate them if you tell us they're involved in something big and are involved. This is in the course of another operation that pertains to national security or whatever. So Nixon, of course, knows about this. So he tells Haldeman, we got to get the CIA to tell the FBI to back off the Watergate investigation. We've got to make it known to the CIA that the FBI is going to get us all in hot water. And so he orders Haldeman to take John Ehrlichman with him, who is the White House Domestic Affairs Advisor, and go meet with Richard Helms, who's the CIA director, and Vernon Walters, who's the deputy, and to basically say to them, you need to get the FBI to back off. Well, Haldeman, as he's being instructed, says to Nixon, well, what am I supposed to tell him? What am I going to tell? This is all in the tapes. What am I going to tell them to say? And Nixon says, quote, tell them to remind them of their agreement, which is the agreement I just spoke about, and basically claim that this Watergate burglary and these is something to do with a CIA operation, and it would be jeopardized if the FBI looked into it. All right. So this is what we've referred to as the smoking gun tape, right? Because this proves, if you're just looking at Nixon and any illegalities involved with Watergate related to Nixon himself, it clearly shows obstruction of justice. He's ordering his underlings to go order the CIA, an agency, a federal agency, to order the FBI to back off. Why? Because Watergate is politically damaging to Nixon. And he says that the direct quote in the tape was, quote, tell them, the CIA, if you, the FBI, allow this investigation of this particular bank account in Mexico City to get pushed further south of the border, it could trespass on some very sensitive covert projects. And since you have these 5 men already under arrest, you ought to let it taper off at that. In other words, he wants to hang the 5 out to dry. 5 are pictured here. And they'll take care, the assumption is, of course, that they'll take care of these 5. They already are. They're paying them hush money. So they'll be well taken care of. They'll fall on their swords, and this operation will get tied off. No one will be the wiser about where this money's coming from and how long this bank account's been paying these covert operators over the years and who's been in charge of all this. He is clearly obstructing justice. This is why they call this the smoking gun tape. This is all happening in that same meeting on the 23rd of 72 between Nixon and Haldeman. And then he says something interesting. You're probably wondering, well, what's all this got to do with E. Howard Hunt, other than the fact that he was one of the 7 arrested? All right, well, we're getting back to it here. On that same tape, Nixon tells Haldeman, quote, this Hunt guy is the key. He's the lever. He will uncover a lot of things. And so Nixon is revealing in this conversation, he has some concerns. He's concerned about this check, this bank account. He doesn't want any investigation into this bank account. And B, he's very concerned about covering up covert, these sensitive, very sensitive covert projects. Let's go back to this previous quote. Something happened further south of the border that he's concerned about hiding. And it involves sensitive covert projects, plural, not just one, plural. And he says, let's keep this to the 5 men. He's specifically excluding from those 5 men the 2 that were arrested across the street to Lookout, because one of those guys is Hunt. He doesn't really mention G. Gordon Liddy, but boy, the Hunt guy comes up in conversation. And he says, this Hunt guy is the key. He's the lever. He will uncover a lot of things. So we're clearly seeing what Nixon's concerned about. This is why previous episodes I've made such a point about saying Nixon was never really worried about Watergate, the burglary. He was worried about what Watergate would lead to, uncover. Specifically, what an investigation into that bank account, where that would lead, an investigation into these sensitive covert projects further south of the border, where that could lead, and any investigation into E. Howard Hunt, where that could lead. So clearly, in Nixon's own word, this guy E. Howard Hunt, he got the attention of the president. And of course, the president used to be, in the 50s, he was in charge of the CIA. I've explained this in another episode, the way the CIA's charter worked. In 47, when it was created under the National Security Act, it put the vice president. The CIA publicly had a couple jobs. A was to collect intelligence. B, report it to the president. But covertly, it also had a job, and that was to carry out covert operations under the guise of a special committee that was classified. Nobody knew about this. It's called the 5412 Committee. And the vice president, whoever the vice president was at that time, was in charge of that. Well, that means Nixon. And of course, the CIA, if you know anything about the 50s, Eisenhower's administration, CIA was running wild all around the world, overthrowing governments, trying to assassinate people. And Nixon was in charge of all that. He's the vice president in charge of the 5412 Committee. So he clearly is worried about he lost the election in 60, so from 60 to 68, he doesn't have the same control over that, but he's clearly worried about his time as vice president leading the CIA covert operations under the 5412 Committee and anything he's been doing since he's been president, 68 to 72. He has now, and of course, the guy he's most worried about is E. Howard Hunt, the guy in the red circle here in the middle of that picture. And he continues on, he says, tell them, talking about E. Howard Hunt, to tell them, the CIA, if they, the FBI, open that scab, talking about E. Howard Hunt, there's a hell of a lot of things that will come out. Tell them that we feel it will be very detrimental to all of us if this thing goes any further. So he's revealing, if we just want to follow the words of Richard Nixon and let his words lead the investigation, he's basically laying a breadcrumb trail to who you need to investigate. You need to look at the bank account, because that's what he's worried about. You need to look at these special covert operations, very sensitive covert operations further south of the border. In other words, we had something going on down there in Mexico, something big going down there in Mexico. And then C, you need to look at E. Howard Hunt. Because if you look into that, he says, you open that scab, there's a hell of a lot of things that'll come out. And he continues, he says, if this gets out, it's going to make the CIA look bad, and it's likely to blow the whole Bay of Pigs thing, which I think would be very bad for both the CIA and the country. Now, this is extremely interesting here, because obviously he's worried about his own self. Obviously, he's worried about his own political career, but he's trying to convince the CIA. He's telling Haldeman this to try to convince the CIA that it's also in their best interests to cover this up, because they have as much skin in the game as he does. And then it's interesting. He says it's likely to blow the whole Bay of Pigs thing. He's already referred to these characters as Bay of Pigs guys. But he was very specific in saying this was not the Bay of Pigs operation, it was something entirely different. But he calls them the Bay of Pigs guys. And then here again, he says it's going to blow the whole Bay of Pigs thing, which is extremely interesting to investigators as they begin looking into this. But it's, and we'll get to that in just a second. But what he is communicating to the CIA through Haldeman and Ehrlichman and all these is something that he understands, and he knows Richard Helms will understand, Vernon Walters will understand, but nobody who's doing the communicating of all this understands what they're saying. They're just repeating what Nixon tells them to say. Haldeman doesn't know what he's saying, at least not initially, but he knows that these code words mean something to Vernon Walters and to Richard Helms. When he says it's likely to blow the whole Bay of Pigs thing. If you're Haldeman at this point, you got to be scratching your head saying, well, what does Nixon care about the Bay of Pigs? That happened under JFK's watch. The whole country, the whole world knows about Bay of Pigs. What a big flop that was. Why is he concerned about any revelations coming out about the Bay of Pigs thing? Why does that matter? Nixon has nothing to do with that. That was all JFK. At least that's the public knowledge of it at that time. This is all in an effort to disguise what he's really saying to Haldeman, but to make, at the same time, make it very clear to Vernon Walters and Richard Helms at the CIA, the stakes that are, what's at stake here. And he's clearly using the Bay of Pigs as a code for something. He keeps referring to it. And of course, we all know that he was not president at the time Bay of Pigs happened, but he's calling these 5 burglars Bay of Pigs guys. And he's saying that any investigation is going to blow the whole Bay of Pigs thing, which doesn't make sense because he wasn't over Bay of Pigs. Why does he care what comes out about Bay of Pigs? That'll make Kennedy look bad, not him. It's clearly code for something else. And Haldeman, who's confused, asks Nixon at this meeting, and this is right on the tape, will they, the CIA, know what that means? You know, and the inference is that he's saying, even though he didn't say it, because I don't know what that means. You worry about Bay of Pigs. I don't understand why you're worried about Bay of Pigs. You're calling these guys Bay of Pigs guys. I don't understand that. What's the concern about E. Howard Hunt? What? I don't get it. But he doesn't ask his boss to explain to him. He just says, will they, the CIA, will Vernon Walters and Richard Helms know what all this means? And Nixon says to Haldeman, oh, yes, they'll know what that means. They'll know what that means. It's interesting. A year later, almost to the day, on June 28, 1973, as this investigation is heating up in Congress, the Senate Watergate Committee Chairman Sam Ervin is going over all this same information that we just went over. He's reading these transcripts of the tapes, and Bob Haldeman is on the stand testifying. And Ervin has the same question that Haldeman had a year earlier when he's talking to Nixon in the White House. And he says, well, what did that mean? Because I don't know what it means either. What's he talking about, Bay of Pigs guys? What's he talking about, Bay of Pigs operation or the whole Bay of Pigs thing? What's he talking about? And in the year since that original conversation that Haldeman had with Nixon in the White House, the Oval Office, he has learned what Nixon meant by Bay of Pigs. Every time he kept referencing Bay of Pigs, he was confused. John Dean was confused. But once they heard the story and put 2 and 2 together, they figured it out. Oh, I see. He's using a code. That's why I didn't understand it. But that's why Richard Helms did. That's why Vernon Walters did. Because they operate by that same code. And of course, they're all spooks in the CIA. And there was a point in time when Nixon was over the CIA and all the covert operations during the time he was vice president over the 5412 Committee, and they all spoke the same language. They were all involved in these operations, and they're all trying to hide it. Anyway, when Sam Ervin asks Haldeman on the stand, what did that mean? Haldeman lays a gigantic matzo ball at the feet of the Senate Watergate Committee, which, if they had been, uh, I don't know, maybe they didn't want to, maybe they didn't want to know. But looking back, this was the point at which the Watergate scandal could have uncovered the truth about the JFK assassination and turned uh, what was at the time a political scandal into of pretty large proportions, but it could have just exploded it. And because any connection to the JFK assassination, it's one thing about burglarizing the DNC headquarters. That's hanky-panky, dirty tricks, crimes were committed. It's another thing we're talking about the assassination of a president, a former president. And here's Haldeman. He tells Irvin, quote, he, Nixon, was referring to the assassination of President Kennedy. In other words, every time he uses the word Bay of Pigs in the tapes, which, if you go back and listen to the tapes or read the transcripts of the tapes, Nixon was obsessed with the Bay of Pigs. He referred to it over and over and over and over. Okay. And he wasn't talking about the Watergate burglary. He wasn't talking about the 5 burglars. He was concerned about the check and the bank account and how that might expose the Bay of Pigs guys, these people that, when he uses the words Bay of Pigs, he's talking about the assassination of President Kennedy. So what he's saying, essentially, he's worried about these guys and their involvement in the assassination of President Kennedy. He calls them Bay of Pigs guys. All right? He's worried about how that account is going to show that they've been being paid by this account, and whoever is depositing the money into that account for activities going back to the time he was vice president. This is the late 50s and 60s, and including the time during which, 63, when JFK actually was assassinated. They were on the payroll. So clearly he's worried about that. He's also worried about these special covert or sensitive, very sensitive covert operations that are further south of the border, plural. So there's other covert operations that these Bay of Pigs guys were involved in, being paid out of this account that nobody else seems to know about. He's very concerned about that. And he's very concerned about E. Howard Hunt, how if you look into him, you're going to uncover everything. That's the matzo ball that Haldeman lays at the feet of the Senate Watergate Committee, that if they had been quick enough on their feet or willing to pursue this at that time, maybe they just didn't have the stomach for it. He said this on an open hearing, and for about 30 seconds, nobody said anything. As everybody sitting there contemplating what they just heard. Oh my God, Nixon is talking about the assassination of President Kennedy. He's not even talking about Watergate. We're all here fussing about Watergate. We're obsessing about Watergate. We're trying to get him impeached for Watergate. And he's worried about the assassination of President Kennedy and how if this investigation goes any further, it's going to link him to that. It's going to link Watergate to that. You can see where this could lead, but it didn't. It never did. It's interesting. Once they got their taste of blood, their pound of flesh, and Nixon had to resign, all the investigation was tied off, and the connection was never made between Watergate and the JFK assassination. They never followed up on E. Howard Hunt's activities going back to this JFK assassination. They never followed up with the bank account. They never followed up with the Bay of Pigs guys. They never followed up with the very sensitive covert projects further south of the border. They didn't go into E. Howard Hunt's background. They just let it lie. That was the opportunity right there in 73 to learn the truth about what had happened 10 years earlier. Haldeman laid it out on a plate for him. So Vernon Walters is sent by Richard Helms, the result of this meeting that Nixon orders Haldeman and Ehrlichman to go talk to Richard Helms and Vernon Walters. The result of all of those meetings, Vernon Walters goes to Pat Gray of the FBI, and he says, if you don't stop all this, the Mexico stuff about the Bay of Pigs guys will come out. We know this because Vernon Walters testified during Watergate hearings and said this is what he said. Pat Gray testified during Watergate hearings and said this is what Vernon Walters told him. So we know this is so the order has come down from on high. And Vernon Walters clearly knows what the code Bay of Pigs guys means and all the stuff that they've been doing and what will come out if they pursue this. He clearly knows what this means because he communicates it to Pat Gray. Pat Gray, the number two, who is now the acting director of the FBI, clearly knows what this means as well. Otherwise, Vernon Walters wouldn't be speaking to him this way. They're speaking in code, but it's clear what is meant here. And the CIA is doing the bidding of the White House and asking the FBI to back off. There's more at stake here than just a simple burglary. All right, so that is, look at my chronological date here. That all happened in late June 73. Now let's fast forward to October, or let's go back to October of 71. This is about a year before the election. And another meeting that is recorded by Oval Office tapes, during which Nixon is meeting, of course, he's President Nixon at this time, he's meeting with the director of the CIA, Richard Helms. And this is something that you would have to go back and listen to understand what Nixon and Helms knew to be true, because this shows the transcript of this tape shows clearly that Nixon has an obsession with something. And the White House, the tapes that came out during Watergate are the first glimpse of that. But if you go back and listen to other tapes that are unrelated to Watergate, they show a continuing pattern on the part of Nixon during the time he's president, trying to cover something up from his past. All right. The Watergate tapes reveal the cover up, and everybody thought he was trying to cover up Watergate. It's not. It's all about the same cover up of something that happened in the past. And if you put these tapes together, these conversations together, you can sort of unlock what that is, the secret. So we're in October 1971. There's a White House meeting between the director of the CIA and the president of the United States. During this meeting, Nixon asks Helms for the entire Bay of Pigs file from Richard Helms. Now, we already know what he means when he says Bay of Pigs. We already know what that means, okay? We've unlocked the key to that code. That means JFK assassination. Helms is hesitant in the meeting. He said, the file's over 100,000 pages, Mr. President. Nixon continues, and he says, quote, I understand the dirty tricks part of it. I know what you did in Iran. The reason he knows is because it was in 54 or 52 or 3. It was in there. And I was vice president. I was over the 5412 committee, and I told you guys to overthrow the government in Iran. That's how he knew. So I know what you did in Iran. I know what you did in Guatemala, which was 54. He was still vice president. He was still over the 5412 committee. He was still in charge of the covert operations. I know what you tried to do at the Bay of Pigs. You know the history there. You know the Bay of Pigs operation was actually put in motion when Nixon was still vice president, with the thought that he was going to win the election in 60, and they would carry it out in April of his first year in office. He didn't, and JFK inherited the plan, and green-lighted it, regretted it later terribly, but that was originally also a Nixon plan. So he's telling Helms, listen, I know all of our dirty secrets. I know what you guys did in Iran. We both know. I know what you did in Guatemala. We both know. I know what you tried to do at the Bay of Pigs. It was a good plan, but Kennedy just didn't follow up. And Helms was looking at him, or you can't see it in the tapes, but you can hear it in his voice. Why do you want this file? You just said yourself it was Kennedy's screw up. It wasn't ours. It wasn't yours. Why do you want this file? And this is when Richard Helms learns firsthand what Nixon means by Bay of Pigs. Okay. We know now, because looking back, he always referred to the JFK assassination as the Bay of Pigs when he was talking amongst his people. They didn't know. And here's where Helms realizes what he's talking about. Nixon finally admits, because Helms is looking at him clearly confused, just like Haldeman was confused. He says, quote, I need it for a negotiation. I really need it. The who shot John angle. In Nixon's own words to Richard Helms, caught there on tape, this is corroboration of what Bob Haldeman later revealed to Sam Ervin. Bay of Pigs is about the JFK assassination. Bay of Pigs guys is about who shot John. In other words, I need this file because I know it talks about the JFK assassination and everything you know about it. The CIA was involved, all the CIA involvement. And I know that it involves information about the people who did it, the people who shot John. And I want that information. I want that file. This is all the way back in 71. So this is a year before the break-in at the Watergate. And when the break-in at the Watergate happens and the Supreme Court orders the tapes released, in real time we see conversations between Nixon and Haldeman, Nixon and Dean, et cetera, where Nixon's not concerned about the Watergate burglary. He's concerned about the Bay of Pigs, the very sensitive covert operations further south of the border. He's concerned about the bank account. He's concerned about the Bay of Pigs guys. He's concerned about E. Howard Hunt. He's concerned about who shot John. And that's confirmed or corroborated by this October 71 meeting between him and the CIA director, Richard Helms, which is why a year later, when Watergate blows up, he can tell Haldeman, when Haldeman says, will Richard Helms know what I mean when I talk about the Bay of Pigs and the Bay of Pigs guys? Will Vernon Walters know what I mean when I talk about the Bay of Pigs and the Bay of Pigs guys? And how this could be detrimental to all of us? And and Nixon says confidently, oh yeah, he'll know what I mean. He'll know what I mean. So essentially what we have here is that the Rosetta Stone of this entire episode is contained in 3 words. You want to know what Watergate was really about and what Nixon was really concerned about? He was concerned about the Bay of Pigs. And any investigation into Watergate, because it involved all of the same people, these Bay of Pigs guys that had been sort of carrying out all these covert operations from the 50s onward, it's the same people. And based upon his conversation in 71 with Helms, he's obsessed with the who shot John angle and how that might come back on him at some point. He didn't need it for a negotiation. He needed it because there was incriminating information in there that could be used against him. And he knew it, and he wanted it. He wanted it so he could squelch it. And of course, the key to all of this is this guy right here pictured. This is E. Howard Hunt. This is why this guy is so important. And interestingly, the story that the specifics of the story that implicate Nixon that we'll get into come from Santos Trafficante, the crime boss down in Florida, who is also the Don over Cuban territory as well. Because you say, well, what's he got to do with it? Well, these 4 Cubans got arrested, 5 burglars, 4 of the 5 were Cubans, came from Florida. And any Cuban from Florida, and during those days, would be on the payroll working for Santos Trafficante. They would be his people. Now, they were simultaneously CIA people because, as we know, the CIA went into partnership with the mob to try to overthrow Castro. And they were using Santos people for Operation 40, later for Operation Mongoose, They were using them for a special operation we're going to get into called the S-Force. This was all conceived when Nixon was vice president. And so Santos Trafficante has special knowledge of everything Nixon's trying to hide because he was head of the crime organization that was providing the manpower for the United States government, CIA specifically, which is carrying out all these covert ops uh, specific to Cuba. They were using his people. So obviously he's going to know. And he never had occasion to tell this story. It's interesting. People say, well, you should listen to Santos Trafficante. He's a crime boss. But everything he says in this story that we're going to go through is corroborated by Nixon himself on the White House tapes. They're speaking the same language. And when Watergate happens, and the F. Lee Bailey law firm is hired to represent James McCord, one of the burglars, and others, maybe some of the Cubans, in the process of trying to defend McCord and the Cubans. F. Lee Bailey has to find out from Trafficante, his other client. Turns out F. Lee Bailey represented Santos Trafficante as well. When he starts to notice that these guys were from Florida, these Cubans, he puts two and two together and he realizes these guys have to be affiliated with Santos Trafficante in some manner, shape, form. He knows something about these guys that I need to know to help defend them. So, long story short, we'll get into more specifics in the next episode, but F. Lee Bailey asks Trafficante to explain the presence of these four Cubans at the Watergate and how they are involved with the White House. And so this is on May 25th of 1973 when they have this conversation, when the F. Lee Bailey law firm meets with Santos Trafficante and they have this conversation. And Santos Trafficante lays it all out. He fills in the gaps. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to go through and fill in the gaps because, there isn't such a thing as attorney-client privilege as long as the client is alive. But when the client's dead, the attorney is no longer bound. So we have an attorney today who is still alive, who was present at these meetings or had access to this information because he worked for the F. Lee Bailey law firm, who's telling us the story that Santos told them that is filling in the gaps of what Nixon's trying to hide about Watergate. What Nixon's so concerned, guys like E. Howard Hunt and the Bay of Pigs guys and these very sensitive covert operations further south of the border and all this stuff that he's trying so desperately to hide, which is why he obstructs justice and orders the CIA to tell the FBI to back off. He's trying to hide all this. Well, it's also the story that was in the 18.5-minute gap that John Dean learned from Nixon that they considered to be so explosive they had to cover it up. And then he claimed later he forgot it. So we have corroboration of corroboration of corroboration. We have Nixon essentially corroborating what Santos Trafficante is going to tell us. We have Santos corroborating what Nixon's saying on the tapes. We have John Dean telling his lawyer the story that corroborates what Santos is saying, what Nixon's trying to hide. And we have Bob Haldeman saying, well, Bay of Pigs means JFK assassination. We have a tape where Nixon is telling Richard Helms that he wants the file, not because of the Bay of Pigs, not because of what happened in Iran or Guatemala, not because of Kennedy's screw up at Bay of Pigs. He wants the file because he wants to know who shot John Angle. It's all about the John F. Kennedy assassination. And so fast forward to May 25th, 1973, the F. Lee Bailey law firm representing these Cubans that have been arrested at Watergate, trying to understand why the Cubans were even there, trying to understand their involvement with the committee to re-elect the president, the plumbers, trying to understand so that they can present a case and defend him. They go to their other client, Santos Trafficante. Well, these are your guys. Clearly, they came from Florida. They came from Miami. They're your guys. Tell us why they were here. Did you know they were here? Of course, Santos knows everything about his guys. Did you approve this? Why did you approve this? What were they doing? What was their purpose? What's their history? Etc. Etc. So that's the story that I'm going to tell you is the Santos Trafficante story, how it pertains to Watergate and connects the JFK assassination to the Watergate scandal. And of course, the importance of E. Howard Hunt in all of this. Remember, we've just laid the groundwork so far in this first episode about Hunt's sort of coming out party, where the American public are starting to learn who this guy is for the first time. He's been involved in all these covert operations for decades. There's a lot to cover up there. And now it's all spilling out on the front pages. Picture, the story. You got the acting FBI director, number two, actually, Mark Felt saying, I'm going to go down and check out this bank account. Nixon's terrified of that. He's terrified of what they'll find when they look into these Bay of Pigs guys. He's terrified what they'll find when he looks into this check. He's terrified what they're going to find if they look into these very sensitive covert projects further south of the border. He's terrified what they'll find if they look into E. Howard Hunt's background. He's the scab. He's the lever. He's the key. He's terrified. And it's not about Watergate. You notice he never talks about, in all these tape conversations, he hardly ever references the burglary itself, anything that's going on at that time. He's always looking backwards. And when you listen to the tapes, it's clear he's obsessed with something having to do with the JFK assassination because he's coded at Bay of Pigs and he talks nonstop about the Bay of Pigs and the Bay of Pigs guys. And then if you go back to the October 71 tape where he's talking to Richard Helms, he wants that file. He wants, that's the thing about Nixon. He was always on a search for any incriminating information somebody might have on him and get his hands on it so he can make it disappear. He wants that file to make it disappear. And that's why when he orders Haldeman to go to the CIA, and Haldeman says, essentially, I don't understand what you're telling me, but that doesn't matter. Will they understand it? Nixon tells him, oh, yes, they'll understand. All right, that's part one of E. Howard Hunt, All the President's Men. We will continue with part two next. Until then, everybody have a great day and God bless. Thank you.